now going to look at what to do when we want to parent assertively. How do we actually do that? We've done a lot of discussing about, the evils, if you will, of passive parenting or overindulgent parenting. But, how do we actually do this assertiveness thing? We're going to look at that now. What to do when you want something from your kid. For example, to follow a rule, to do a chore, to meet a reasonable parental expectation, to accept an appropriate discipline, and so forth. The first step in asserting yourself when you want something from your child is to clearly state your expectation. For example, be sure to pick up your dirty clothes off of the bedroom floor. It's time to get ready for bed, or I need you to put the dirty dishes in the dishwasher, and so forth. So that's step one. You want to clearly state your expectation. We're not asking, okay? We're not going to say, could you, or would you, or will you please? So we're not asking, we're telling, but we're also doing it in a way that's assertive rather than aggressive. Now, if your child follows through with what you have asked him to do within a reasonable amount of time, and that's usually anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, then this is where you want to pour on the intensity in the form of acknowledgement and praise. For example, you did a great job of getting the dishes out of the sink and into the dishwasher. Thank you. Or I appreciate that you've got all your dirty clothes up off the floor. Or thank you for getting your homework done and getting ready for bed. I see that you're being responsible. Or that's you being successful. These types of things. Okay? You don't have to bring out the clowns and the balloons in a big parade. All you have to do is say, hey, I've noticed that you're doing this. Good job. Now, if your child refuses to do what you've asked, or threatens to refuse to do what you've asked, then this is where you issue a warning in the form of an if-then statement. And it goes like this. If you choose to ignore my request, you'll choose a consequence, which will be blah, blah, blah. And in the blank there, you want to pick the least restrictive consequence first. Now, this is a lot like the art of saying no. In fact, if you haven't looked at that particular session, this is the session that we talk about what to do when your child wants something from you, and we looked at the art of saying yes and the art of saying no, then you'll want to go back and research that, because this strategy is going to be very similar to that one at this point. Now, if 5 to 10 minutes has gone by and your warning had no effect, in other words, they are still refusing to do what you've asked them to do, then this is when you basically repeat what you said before, but now we'll say it in the past tense. Because you chose to ignore my request, you also chose the consequence, which is blah, 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 and again, we pick the least restrictive consequence first. Now, also, if they ignore your request, you don't want to get sucked into a power struggle. You allow them to make the poor choice to ignore your request. That's right. You go ahead and let them make that mistake. We can't make them do chores. We can't make them do anything. But if they refuse to do the chore, we can issue a consequence. So this, again, is about controlling their stuff and their freedom and not their behavior. You can't make your child spit. You can't make him stand on his head. You can't make him do chores. You can't make him do anything that he doesn't want to do. But you can issue a consequence if he chooses to make a poor choice. Now, after you have issued the least restrictive consequence first, since he did not follow through with your request, and he says, well, I'm not going to accept that consequence. I'm going to get on the phone anyway, or I'm going to get on the computer anyway, or I'm going to walk out of the house and go next door anyway, even though I'm grounded. Then this is where you kick it up a notch and you ground him for 3 days with all of his privileges taken away, or at least his favorite stuff. If he has a temper tantrum when he discovers that he's now going to get the 3-day discipline, the 3 days does not start until he calms down. I mean, he's still grounded with no privileges, but the clock does not start until he calms down. Okay? Now, there's some other points that we need to look at, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions with respect to exactly how to do this 3-day discipline stuff. So we'll look at that next. Now, at this point, one of the questions that parents often ask when they're in the live group is, where do I put all this stuff that I take from my child? Well, some parents designate a closet with a padlock on it, and they store confiscated stuff in there. Some parents put their kids' stuff in the trunk of their car. Now, their bumper may be dragging the ground on the way to work, but it's still a good place to store stuff. Some parents have a neighbor or a relative that lives next door or close by, and they'll take the kids' stuff over there. Other parents have been known to throw less expensive items in the trash, for example, toiletries, junk food, and even some clothes. Now, this isn't cruel punishment. It is unusual discipline. But remember, we're dealing with non-traditional kids, and they need non-traditional parenting strategies. Another question that often comes up is, how am I supposed to get my kid's computer, for example, in the trunk of my car? Well, here we want to be very creative. In fact, in some cases, we want to do the last thing that we'd ever think to do first. Now, there's always a simple way to confiscate. For example, we can just take the computer keyboard rather than the whole computer. We could just take the cable cord from the television rather than the whole television. PlayStation controllers, DVDs, CDs, cell phones, iPods, all of those things are very easy to hide. Now, if the item is too big to carry out of the kid's room, just disable it. Now, some parents have discovered that when they confiscate their child's stuff, their child confiscates some of their stuff. So if your kid returns the favor by taking or hiding some of your things, you want to put on your poker face and calmly tell him that the clock does not start for the 3-day discipline until your stuff is returned. He's still grounded with no privileges, but the clock does not start until you get your stuff back. Now, if he continues to keep your things, you may need to go the extra step and tell him that you'll be willing to call the police and press charges in order to convince him that taking your stuff is actually theft and has additional legal consequences. Now, let's look at another common problem that comes up when the parent issues a 3-day discipline. Let's say that you've issued that discipline. For example, your child has violated curfew, but then he creates a new problem before completing the 3-day discipline. Let's say, for example, he calls you a bad name, and he has a temper tantrum and he throws a plate in the sink too hard and the plate breaks. The question then is, do you restart the 3 days? Or is this totally unrelated to the curfew violation and gets a different consequence? Well, the answer is you only restart the 3-day discipline if the original crime is recommitted. In this case, if the son violates curfew again. When parents issue a 3-day discipline, it's very common for kids to introduce additional behavior problems. For example, temper tantrums, threats, yelling, name calling, and so on. And they do this as a way to get you sidetracked from the original consequence and to get the focus off of them and onto your anger. So if parents fall for this, the parent ends up issuing additional consequences on top of existing consequences. Restrictions against the kid begin to pile up, and before long, he's grounded for 3 months with no privileges, and both you and your child have forgotten what the original problem was. So don't let this happen to you. Do not let your son get you distracted from the original problem and the associated consequence for that problem. Now, here's how you do this. If your son commits another crime, figuratively speaking, during a 3-day discipline, you're going to put this new crime in the deal with it later file. You literally write the problem down on a piece of paper. For example, son called me a name and broke a plate. And then you put this note to yourself somewhere where you can find it after the original 3-day discipline is completed. Now, after that original 3-day discipline is completed, you then confront your son regarding the second, third, or fourth problem that he introduced by saying, just for your information, in the future, if you choose to blah, 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 in that line, we're using the example of call me a name and break a dish, then you'll choose the consequence, which is, and here you're going to state that he opts for a stiffer consequence. Here's the sequence. Your child violated curfew. You issued the 3-day discipline. He introduced 2 new problems. on top of the original problem by calling you a name and breaking a plate. You put these new problems in the deal with it later file. After he completes the 3-day discipline, you pull that note to yourself out of the deal with it later file, and you say to him, in the future, when you've been issued a 3-day discipline and you call me that name or destroy property, you also choose a 7-day discipline. Now, does he get off the hook in a way for calling you a name and breaking the plate? Well, to be honest with you, yes, for the time being he does. We don't want restrictions to pile up so high that he's grounded forever, because we can never follow through with that. That's an empty threat. So he does kind of get off the hook for those new problems that he introduces, but only for the time being, because you're going to give him a warning after he completes his 3-day discipline that in the future, if he introduces those 2 problems, specifically those 2, then the 3 days automatically goes to 7 days. Another question that often comes up is, when we talk about taking everything away, does it really need to be everything? Well, it's not always necessary to take everything away. I have had some parents who have taken everything away. There was no games, no junk food, there was nothing. The child was either grounded to his room or grounded from his room, and he didn't even have a bedroom door. So in the worst case scenarios, where you issued a 1-day, that didn't work, you issued a 3-day, that didn't work, you issued a 7-day, that didn't work, you may want to consider taking everything away. But 9 times out of 10, your child only has like 2 or 3 things that he really favors. So usually you don't have to resort to taking everything away.